What might ISIS and Ukraine have in common? More than you think. For one, Western war propaganda is filled with Ukrainian soldiers sporting ISIS patches. It makes sense, as Kiev's essentially been harboring ISIS leaders fleeing the so-called caliphate. Back in 2022, there were reportedly at least 87 members of the terrorist group who were able to settle in Ukraine with the help of contacts throughout the Middle East.
The sources confirmed that an official of the Al-Nusra Front terrorist organization held a series of meetings with leaders of several armed organizations, during which he urged them to encourage jihad in Ukraine against Russian forces.
And many of those Islamist terrorists have gone on to wage jihad against Russia there, armed with the field experience they got from the Syrian civil war, fighting against Bashar al-Assad's government. According to Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, ISIS militants were even trained by the U.S. military at the Al-Tanf military base in Syria.
The US and British intelligence services have de facto turned the territory of Poland into a logistical hub used for supplying weapons and ferrying militants, including those from the Middle East, to Ukraine. Thus, at the end of 2021, the Americans released from prisons of the Kurdish wing of the Syrian Democratic Forces several dozen Islamic State terrorists, among them citizens of Russia and other post-Soviet countries. These individuals were sent to the US-controlled Al-Tanf base, where they underwent special training in methods of sabotage and terrorist warfare, with an eye on the Donbass region.
But the roots of this nefarious union go farther back than just 2 years ago. Back in 2015, the presence of Islamist terrorists in Ukraine was already raising eyebrows in Europe.
On 7 July, the New York Times reported the presence of a Chechen volunteer force made up of ISIS sympathizers in territories disputed by Russian separatists and Ukrainian troops. It appears that they have openly sided with Ukraine in a bid to weaken Russia and compel it to concentrate its forces on that country, drawing resources away from other fronts on which it is pitted against various Islamic terrorist groups.
Ukraine's foreign ministry was quick to dismiss what Salvini said as nonsense, despite the mountain of evidence to the contrary. 4 years later, the CIA and Georgia's Interior Ministry discovered that one of ISIS's most important commanders was living it up in the quiet Ukrainian town of Belaya Tserkov on false documents for 3 whole years. Then there's the anti-Russian Ichkerian Chechens who fought 2 wars against Moscow and are now also fighting alongside Ukrainian troops. Like Ahmed, who fought in both Chechen wars throughout the 1990s and joined Kiev right after Russia's military operation began. The Ichkerians even formed their own Sheikh Mansour battalion, mainly comprising of mercenaries and Islamist fundamentalists.
We have reliable information that Islamic State militants and their ilk are fighting against us as part of Ichkerian and Crimean Tatar units. They are also part of the sabotage and reconnaissance groups that are sent into Russian territory to carry out attacks and acts of terrorism.
Most important to remember is that support for the vast majority of these groups can all be traced back to one place.
The US military is actively recruiting fighters from jihadist groups affiliated with the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda to carry out terrorist acts in Russia and the CIS. Particular attention is paid to attracting natives of the Russian North Caucasus and Central Asia. We are witnessing the final loss of any moral principles in the United States security forces. Obsessed with the insane idea of exsanguinating Russia, Washington strategists consider it acceptable to directly use terrorists for their own dirty purposes. Such actions put Washington on a par with the largest international terrorist groups.
ISIS, Ichkerians, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, many different puppets, but at the end of the day, only one master.
The United States and the rest of the major NATO countries have been facilitating terrorist attack for Ukraine for more than 2 years. The assassination of Alexander Dugin's daughter, as an example. The continued shelling of places like Belgorod with missiles, rockets, artillery pieces provided by the West. That's as much facilitating terrorism as it was whoever bought these guys the rifles and stashed it for these guys to go shoot civilians. I think the United States is playing some very, very dangerous games here.